Welcome back to the Bible and History. I'm Jeff Johnson, and with me, of course, is my mother, Rebecca Johnson. And today we're going to be continuing talking about the world history, what was going on around the world about the time of Abraham and Lot and different things like that. We're going today to be focusing on the Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, all those different islands. Very interesting and somewhat more difficult region to settle because it's all islands, and so you gotta figure out where all the islands are. You gotta do some sailing and different things like that. So a little bit more complex, and a very understudied part of history, I think, for the most part. We talk about Australia when the British come through and create the prison colonies, but nothing's really ever said about it before that point, for the most part. And so we're going to dive into this a little bit. No Bible verses here. This is the Pacific, and the Bible doesn't really go into that far away.
No,
so we're going to dive right into this and talk about some interesting groups and some interesting words that we cannot pronounce.
Yes. Yay. Well, let's get into it. So, about the time that Isaac was born, out in the Pacific, things are getting really busy. And there were settlers going throughout the islands. There were three main ways to settle. We're going to talk about three groups that settled, basically, and we're going to talk about those three groups. Now, the islands closest to India, the Malaysian islands, Philippines, that type of thing, they were connected via land bridge. This was the Ice Age, and yes, there was an Ice Age. We talked about this. It came after the flood. It lasted about 500 years. And so, yes, there were areas that were more connected at the time of the Ice Age. And so, yes, some of them did walk down, but as you mentioned, that didn't touch Australia, New Zealand, any of the Fiji Island Kingdom, anything from the Tower Islands. So we have a lot of the Pacific that's not applicable to. Now, as we mentioned before, it doesn't make any sense to say that it took forever for us to figure out how to sail. Noah sailed, and everybody knew how to do it when they left the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
So,
pretty much everybody was sailing as soon as they left the tower. Half the people sailed to the locations they settled.
Exactly. So that's the reason it all took place very quickly, and it was all blossoming all at once. It wasn't different evolutionary points. It was the same people group leaving, 70 language groups leaving the Tower of Babel. Now, I want to talk a lot today specifically about the island of New Zealand, which, if you know anything about New Zealand, immediately what's going to come to mind as the first people of New Zealand were the Maori warriors, except they weren't. And even the Maori historians will tell you this. I uncovered this wonderful video on YouTube, Skeletons in the Cupboard series, and it really delves into the history of the pre-Maori New Zealand. Who was there when the Maori warriors arrived? The Maoris know exactly who sailed the boat that brought them in to the New Zealand zone. And they will tell you that when they got there, there was a group of dwarves, small people, which have now been listed as fairies by the New Zealand government. They have tried to mysticize this and turn it into a false story. We don't really know why. The Maori don't know why. They don't want to acknowledge people existed before them, other than maybe it messes up their evolutionary chain. I don't know. But
people do weird things sometimes.
Yes. This group of dwarves called the
Patuparaihi, I think is how you say
it. Were blonde to red-haired, and they sported the face tattoo. If you've seen a Maori with the face tattooing, that is not original to the Maori people. That was given to them by the Patupareihi people.
Patupareihi.
And it was interesting because they would only come out at night or in misty weather. And according to the Maori, they were the ones that taught the Maori how to build nets, the cat's cradle, and how to make the Maori flute, the putorino. Now, there's a park in New Zealand that has the deep caves that look like a village site. The New Zealand government claims they're natural caves and they just came to look that way. But the Maori claim that they were built that way. They were carved out that way by these people. There are also man-made amphitheaters that were used by the Patupareihi people to sing, which was a tradition that they passed on to the Maoris. And the Maori warriors are incredible singers today. It's really cool to listen to Maori people singing.
They have
an incredible tone.
Yeah, great voices and just great tone. If you ever get to listen to them, do so. It's a lot of fun.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of fun.
But they got all of that from this people, these small, blonde-haired people. And it's interesting because if you look at the Maoris today, most of them have very, very distinct features, okay? A Maori is a Maori. Except that every now and then you're going to find a blonde or a redhead. And that blonde hair comes from intermarrying with the Patupareihi people.
Yep.
And that is where the blonde gene came from. It is also interesting to note that the Maoris also claim there was another set of people on the island. Not just these people, but another set. And they were tall, red or blonde-haired giants. Now, DNA studies have been done on the descendants of these people who are mixed again into the Maori warriors. If you look at the Maori people, you're going to find blondes and then you're going to find some redheads. They've done a DNA analysis on the descendants who had to fight for the right to do this, by the way. I mean, this is how much the government wants to cover it up. And it has been discovered that they are from the Persian, where the Persian Empire would be. Okay, they were from that region of the world. And interestingly enough, this is going to keep tying in, okay? They have the same DNA track that shows that they are part of the red-haired giant groups that settled in Peru and who went on to settle the South Pacific. So, let's go back to New Zealand, okay? And so here comes the Maori. They are met by two separate and distinct people groups. We have the short, blonde-haired, and we have the giant, red-haired. Now, it's interesting, when you study giants, okay, first of all, we talked about giants before. Giants still exist, and the giant gene went on the ark.
Yep.
Okay, which is why we don't think that they were demons, okay, because God would have just eliminated them, but that they were actually humans that produced giants. And we know giants are mentioned in the Bible.
Yep.
Well past the flood.
David fought one and who had 4 brothers, so
exactly.
He was well aware of even way down the road.
Now, as I've studied giants, there's something really interesting. There's the red-haired giants who apparently appeared very peaceful and would run from any conflict. And then there's also the dark-haired giants who were very mean and often practiced cannibalism. And the peaceful giants appear to have fled in 2 directions from some type of warfare on the mainland of what is now Asia, Africa, Middle East. They're in what it would become the Persian Empire.
Yep.
In their flight, some of them headed to New Zealand. I'm sure they went part of the way via land bridge, but then they would sail on to New Zealand. However, others of them sailed straight across to South America. And Central South America, they eventually would travel south into Peru. And they would build the megalith structures that are found there. Now, Peru is another place, unfortunately, South America is kind of ignored.
Yeah.
like oh yeah, and there were Aztecs and Mayans and whatever, and then there were Spanish people.
Yeah.
Well, okay, there was way more than Spanish people and more than Aztecs and Mayans. Predating all of them, we talked about the Olmec and the pre-Olmec, but we also had this group who came and built major megalith structures in South America.
Yeah.
For example, Machu Picchu. Now, there are 2 levels of construction at Machu Picchu. The bottom level of construction was built by a more advanced and larger race of people. They can see this distinctly. It's really, really cool. There is also all over Peru these walls that are huge. You can't get a piece of paper between these boulders. Mm-hmm. And we have a missionary friend who grew up in Peru. And he's a Peruvian national. And he was telling us about some of these amazing places. When he went to university, before he got saved, he went to State University and he studied a lot of this architecture because he was an art major. Mm-hmm. And he lived in an earthquake zone. Peru is entirely on an earthquake zone. It's on a fault line. And he talked about one day, they had this earthquake. It was like a 7.6 or something. They run outside. The buildings, they're shaking and everything. And right nearby is one of these megalith structures. The thing didn't move. Those boulders just flex and they're perfectly aligned to withstand a major earthquake.
Yeah, which when you think really actually stop for just a second and think about it. Peru is, like we just said, located on a fault line. And those megalith structures are still there.
Mm-hmm.
Buildings that we've built within the past 20 years aren't there anymore. Fallen over because of all the earthquakes. So they had some kind of way of, they understood what was happening. Maybe they experienced an earthquake. Maybe they just understood that earthquakes would occur there. I don't know. But they had a way to prevent their buildings from falling apart. Like all of ours do. And that is fascinating.
It really is.
Because it's not just earthquakes either. You have to be able to withstand so many different kinds of natural disasters. And they've withstood the test of time. All of these megalith structures across the world. Mm-hmm. Which kind of point back to this fact that they understood things that even we today don't.
Yes. Yes. They knew something. And the fact that we think we're getting smarter, are you joking me right now? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is just fascinating. Now, obviously, the second layer of Machu Picchu was built by a later group that came in and built on top of the existing structure. There's even evidence of that written down, that when they got to Machu Picchu, it was already there. Mm-hmm. Which the altitude of that place.
Yeah. It's okay. Pretty high up there. It's pretty high.
Now, another interesting thing that ties these red-haired giants around the world, that ties them both to the Middle East and Asia, to the people on the islands of the South Pacific, and here in Peru, are the reed boats that you find on Lake Titicaca. They still use the same reed boats today. The thing is that exact reed design is found all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
That if they had developed separately, if they had all walked over a land bridge and hiked down for hundreds of years, they would not all have the exact same reed boat design. This just proves they all came from the same central location. It's also been shown that these statues on Easter Island were carved by the red-haired giants. There is a lot of information about this. And if you've ever seen photos of them, perhaps you've been there, but if you've ever noticed photos of them, some of them have this weird top knot, and it's red. And there is the possibility and assumption that that red top knot is actually their hair.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an amazing, obviously the statues on Easter Island are pretty amazing. And no one really knows why.
Yeah. Random heads.
Let's just carve a bunch of giant stones. But again, megalith structures that have withstood the test of time. Well, as I studied Peruvian history and studied South American history, for whatever reason, probably because we are afraid of things that are bigger than us, these giants were consistently attacked in each zone that they settled. And the legends of many of the South Pacific island states that red-haired giants sailed from Peru, which of course wasn't Peru at the time, but sailed from what we know as Peru, on rafts and settled the Pacific Islands. Now that might sound very far-fetched to us, but it was proven.
Yeah.
It was proven by National Geographic, actually, Thor Heyerdahl and his companions. They were Dutch, maybe Swedish.
I think so.
They got National Geographic to sponsor them. I think National Geographic probably at the time thought they would drop dead in the bottom of the ocean, but it was one of those things like, hey,
why
if
not?
we get a good deal out of it, great. They did what they called the Kon-Tiki experiment. They actually went with their team to Peru. They went up into the Amazon, got the very specific logs. They had heard the legend when they were exploring the South Pacific from the elders on various islands, not just one. Mm-hmm. And they just really wanted to find out if this was true. So they went and they gathered the appropriate logs, got all the paperwork done, and they sailed, and they did in fact land in the South Pacific.
Yeah,
on the way, they discovered a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a great story to read,
oh, it really
and
is.
I would highly recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a decent amount of time. I can't remember when exactly, but it was back in the 1900s, I think.
Nope, 1960s, 1950s.
Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't as much shipping, and the sights they saw in the water was just incredible, and things that we still don't understand today. And it was an incredible journey and a lot of really interesting things. And they proved that you could easily sail from Peru to the Pacific Islands. And they got there. Everybody was fine, healthy. They, fishing and all this kind of stuff. They had fish fly onto their boat. Flying fish were just smacked aside because they had like a little hut thing and just smack up. They grab it, and fry it. There's our fish. Like it was an incredibly easy voyage for just being a bunch of log rafts.
It is a great book, and I'm noticing that our time is running out, and there's so much more to say about these red-haired giants. So we're going to talk about them again, but if you at all are interested, I highly recommend reading the Kon-Tiki expedition, the Kon-Tiki, and they wrote a secondary book. They did a second run, and I can't remember what it's called right now, but do get the Kon-Tiki, look it up, read about it. Very fascinating. And then I would highly recommend going to YouTube and looking up Redheads Part 1 and Part 2 of Skeletons in the Cupboard series on YouTube. Very informative. A lot of Maori people involved in this and are talking about it and the history that they think should be told about the island of New Zealand. So I would highly recommend you look it up because there's so much on this topic that we can't even possibly get into.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there's a lot here, and unfortunately we can't unpackage all of it for you, so you'll have to do a little bit of study. And I hope you will. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know we have. Join us next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. If you liked it, please like the video. And if you have any questions, you can comment in the YouTube comment section or email us at thebibleandhistory@gmail.com. We'd love to try to answer those questions for you because there's just so much here that we can't quite get to. And so if you do have anything, we'd love to try to expound upon that for you. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe to our channel.
You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and Google Podcasts.